Monday morning. We're so glad you're here. My name is Cynthia Liston, and I'm with the North Carolina Community College System Office, and it is indeed my great pleasure to introduce this Access session this morning and the speakers for the plenary presentation. So, college access, why is access so important? As we learned from Mark Milliron yesterday, access to post-secondary education is critical because we know that the majority of jobs by 2018 will require some form of post-secondary credential. And we know that post-secondary credentials are the passport to a job that pays a family-sustaining wage in today's economy. But what does access mean? Does it mean finding the way to our college's front door and filling out an application? Does it mean applying for financial aid? Learning the language of college and how to navigate our processes? Personally, based on my own experiences, sometimes I think possibly the hardest part of access at many of our campuses is finding a parking spot. So yes, college access means all of those things. But access also means dedicated intentionality to create systems that support student success as soon as students enter our doors. And access means creating policies and programs that create effective and efficient paths towards college-level coursework. For all of those reasons, access is one of the three central pillars of Success NC. And we're fortunate today to have two speakers who know and lead firsthand national policy and research efforts related to college access. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. And for the sake of efficiency, I'm going to introduce both of them right now. Michael Collins from Jobs for the Future will speak first, followed by Clive Belfield from the Community College Research Center. Michael is the Associate Vice President for Postsecondary State Policy at Jobs for the Future in Boston. He has led JFF's state policy work for nationally recognized initiatives, including Achieving the Dream and the Developmental Education Initiative over the past 8 years. North Carolina has been heavily involved in both of those initiatives. Along the way, Michael has convened leading education and policy thought leaders. He's supported a national network of policy innovators. He's written and published widely and presented throughout the nation. Michael's team at JFF now serves as the National Assistance Partner for State Policy for Completion by Design, the new Post-Secondary Completion Education Initiative funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Michael is an innovator, a thought leader, and a great friend to North Carolina. Michael will be followed by Clive Belfield, who is an associate professor of economics at Queens College City University in New York and a researcher at the Community College Research Center at Columbia University in New York. Dr. Belfield has published widely on the economics of education and written 3 books, the most recent of which is The Price We Pay: The Economic and Social Cost of Inadequate Education. He's also associate editor of the Economics of Education Review and teaches at the Evaluators Institute at the George Washington University. Clive will share with us insights about access and placement, describing the latest CCRC national research regarding how North Carolina and other states should consider using additional information to determine whether students are prepared for credit-bearing coursework in our colleges. So again, it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers, and please join me in welcoming them.
It's great to be here in North Carolina. I got in last night. It was a little cloudy, but I got into the Sheridan. I was very comfy, and I started poring over my slides to see what I would say to help you understand a national conversation that's happening right now around helping students meet their education and workforce goals. Now, specifically, I'm supposed to talk about developmental education, but I'm framing it a little bit differently because I want you to join me in thinking about the way we serve underprepared students differently. So in this national conversation, I just lost my, there we go. In this national conversation, I've been fortunate to support a number of states over the last 8 years, as Cynthia said, at Jobs for the Future. And for those of you who don't know, we are a research, policy, and advocacy firm. As Cynthia said, we're based in Boston, but we work across the nation. And our mission is to help the people who are struggling in our nation's economy to earn credentials that pay family supporting wages with benefits. And we, in partnership with the Gates Foundation, Illumina Foundation, and of course the Obama administration's goals for more people earning post-secondary credentials, we believe, as Mark said yesterday, I missed his talk, but as he said yesterday, we believe that post-secondary is a powerful lever to break the intergenerational cycle of poverty. So in our work at Jobs for the Future, state policy is an important part of what we do. I lead that area of Jobs for the Future. And when I say state policy, we work specifically with departments of higher education, coordinating boards, system offices like the North Carolina Community College System, and in some cases, community college associations. And so what we do is we have states come together, kind of cross state lines, and we essentially form a network to where states are accelerating their learning by comparing their policy development efforts in state with other states. And they're learning about the best way to structure state-level policies in ways that help community colleges help students reach their education and workforce goals. I want to just say a brief word about the initiatives, because there's a sequence and logic to the national conversation around developmental education. When we started in Achieving the Dream in 2004, that initiative, funded by the Illumina Foundation, was squarely focused on students meeting their success goals, but it started with passing their developmental education requirements. The initiative was not only about developmental education, it was broader, but then in 2009, with funding from the Gates Foundation, we went deeper to focus in on developmental education specifically. What were the best practices? What were the models? What types of data systems did we need to have to better understand what we need to do to get students who are underprepared through developmental education and onto their education and workforce goals? And continuing that sequence and logic, Completion by Design builds on those previous efforts to serve students who are underprepared. But I think that you'll see as we have our conversation that we are thinking about developmental education much differently than when we started in 2004. So I know that Mark talked about the importance of post-secondary credentials, and I just want to say a word about that because it is the backdrop of our conversations across states. So North Carolina and the other states, when they come together to think about structuring state policies in ways that help you do your work better, in the back of their minds and in the back of our kind of conversations, we are thinking about how do we get students who are the most vulnerable in our economy, low income, communities of color, immigrants, how do we help them transition into the knowledge economy? That's what's the backdrop of this conversation, and we know, as was stated earlier, that 2/3 of all of the job openings in the future will require some type of post-secondary education beyond high school. So that's not lost on the public, right? So across all races and incomes, we see more and more enrollment in post-secondary. Particular jumps for low-income communities. But again, people intuitively understand that there's been a shift and that they need something beyond high school. But the vast majority of those students, when they come to community college, when they come to post-secondary, we know that among the low-income and communities of color, they're actually disproportionately represented in community colleges. When they come to community college, they face an immediate barrier. So over 60%, it's not over 60%, 60%, the national data suggests that 60% of all students who come into community colleges take one or more developmental education course. Now I said over 60% because Tom Bailey at Teachers College, Columbia, the Community College Research Center, he says that because that there are policy loopholes, if you will, that some students can actually avoid enrolling in developmental education, and some of the data sets that talk about the incidence of developmental education, they don't capture older students, that if we included a broader number, he believes that it's reasonable to estimate that 2/3 of all students in community colleges have an academic weakness in one or more areas that threaten their chance of completion. So this is a big problem, and we've been puzzled because the outcomes are so low for the students, right? What we're doing in developmental education isn't having the effect that we would like it to have. Only 25% of students who take one or more developmental education courses completes a credential, a certificate, or a degree within 8 years of enrollment, and that's in comparison to 40% of their peers who enter college ready. So what do we know about helping these students? And I apologize, I know the folks in the back probably can't read the slide, but I'll just summarize. We have learned so much since the beginning of Achieving the Dream. We know so much more. When we first started, most of the evidence we had, we were focused on best practices, and we were really looking at data that was descriptive, correlational. To be really honest, a lot of what we were considering evidence was not as rigorous as optimal. We now have some rigorous quantitative studies that really challenge the very foundations of how we deliver developmental education. We have some very methodologically rigorous research that suggests that the way that we deliver developmental education, that traditional way in sequences, it doesn't have an appreciable impact on student completion, right? So that makes us think, right, in the national conversation. We also have a series of longitudinal studies that really have kind of lifted the covers off of what happens to students in the progression. How do students progress through developmental education? And we found out something interesting. It's not about courses. Most developmental education enrollments end in a successful completion. It's about a sequence. Students can't get through multi-course sequences. So the national community, the states, are grappling with what we do with this. Finally, the way that we assess students, huge flaws. Some of the recent research has found that the Accuplacer, the compass, those cut scores that we use to sort students as to college ready or not, have a very weak connection to the students' completion outcomes, and we really need to rethink them, particularly since they are such high stakes tests, right? A student comes in, they take a test, they take it cold, that test can determine their trajectory, and it can matter whether they enter a college level course or whether it takes them much, much longer to meet their education and workforce goals. So the upshot of that research that I just talked about, there is consensus that we need to be working together in 4 areas. One, we have to redesign at scale. The success outcomes are so anemic that we really need to start from scratch in some cases and reimagine how we serve students who are underprepared. Rethinking assessment, right? Are there better ways than placement cut scores that we can use to place students? We need to reduce the time that students spend in developmental education, accelerate the time in which that they engage in that college credit content or that career content that they came to community college for in the first place. And finally, as we look forward to the future, we really need to think through the relevance of what we are doing. We have been so focused on developmental education at the front end that sometimes we haven't thought through what does it all mean for the students' overarching education and workforce goals. We've got to think about it more than just developmental education. So let me just run through really quickly some things that are happening in North Carolina and in states in which are in the network. So with regard to redesigning, on average, developmental education as traditionally delivered does not appreciably improve completion. And so we've got some really bold examples. The state of Texas, for example, in 2009, they set aside $5 million for developmental education demonstration projects, and they made competitive grants to institutions, to community colleges who were willing to redesign their instructional delivery models, their intake models, just floor to ceiling, redesign how you serve students that test into developmental education. And not only that, the state waived policy requirements to really let the institutions, to let that innovation blossom. That work has gone on for the past few years. There's a recent evaluation that has come out, and we are pouring through that for lessons. I offer it to you as just an example of a bold strategy to rethink developmental education. We have examples of this reimagining at scale. That's new. When we started Achieving the Dream, part of why Achieving the Dream was started, it was started because there were so many pilots and very few things scaled. I'll use another example from Texas. Texas, right now, all of the 50 community college districts are moving away from a math sequence that's based on the calculus track. They are doing the new Mathways project. That project looks at students' educational goals and aligns their math developmental education requirements to their goals. So they will have a quantitative literacy pathway, they'll have a statistics pathway, as well as a STEM pathway for those students who actually need the calculus. And that work is happening now. So it's going to be at scale. It's also going to be embedded into the funding system, so they'll be able to sustain it. So as you know, you are also involved in major redesigns and major rethinking developmental education, and I'll talk about some of that, what you're doing in a second. Really quickly here, I'm going to have to speed up. The rethinking assessment. Almost every state that we're working with is rethinking how they place students into developmental education, given the evidence. So Florida, North Carolina, Texas, all three of these states are right now working with testing, vending organizations, trying to develop customized assessments that really reduce the high-stakes nature of assessment, that look at where a student is weak, where a student is strong, not an in or out cut score, but really trying to increase their diagnostic capacity so that students have information about where they're weak and strong, and so that institutions have information that they can actually do something about, as opposed to college ready or not. North Carolina, which you're going to hear about in a little bit, is really on the cutting edge of the conversation around assessment. I think that the work that you're doing to determine whether there are alternative measures, other measures that you can use besides cut scores to place students, I think it's cutting edge, I think it's leading edge, and your sister states are going to learn so much from the venture that you're on, and I commend you for that work, and I think you'll hear a little bit about that later. Reducing the time. This graphic, it's a shame that you can't see it in the back, because it's powerful, it's a compelling example of why we need to do something differently about the way that we structure developmental education delivery. This graphic shows students who are placed 3 levels down in developmental education. This is from the Achieving the Dream data set. And so the red there those are boxes, students leaving the system. The green on the left side are students who pass. So essentially, what is happening is students that are assessed 3 levels down, you lose roughly 20%, 18% off the bat. They get dinged, you're 3 levels down, they're like, I'm out of here. I can't do a year and a half before I can take my first college credit course. So they're gone. Of those that enroll, 57% pass, you lose some, but then of those 57%, not all of those enroll in the next course, right? And the hemorrhaging continues at each level. You have students pass and not enroll in the next course, and then you have some of the students that, just kind of, they fall off. This aesthetic creates the reality that only 16% of students in that data set that were 3 levels down ever met their developmental education requirements. And now, mind you, they haven't even attempted their gatekeeper course. And as you might imagine, the hemorrhaging continues. You have students that will finish that sequence and then won't enroll in the gatekeeper course. Certainly, we have to eliminate those loss points. And so North Carolina is on the cutting edge of doing just that. I know that many of you are aware of the great work that the task force is doing, is leading, I believe you're all doing, but redesigning developmental education math to more closely diagnose what students need and then align the treatment to what they need. So the work that you're doing to develop the modules as alternatives to this course-based sequence, I think is cutting edge. You're not alone in that work. Virginia is also doing similar work, and we're talking wall-to-wall, all-college redesign. This is big, and you're leading the nation, and you should feel very proud of that. I know it might feel uncomfortable because it's new, but you really are out front on this. You know, there's a conversation around the students who are at the lowest level. What do we do with students who, you know, they're so low that, you know, any sequence is just not going to be feasible. And so for that work, North Carolina is going to be participating in the Accelerating Opportunity Initiative. And what that work is, it's drawing off the work that the Washington IBEST model, where you are integrating basic skills content and career content and aligning that with credentials that have a value in the labor market so that you can get students who are the highest need students into credentials that have labor market value in kind of a co-requisite model, as opposed to them kind of getting their basic skills before they can take their career content. Lots of great work going on there. So we are wrapping up here. All this work is great, but it's all been about developmental education. Well, part of the problem is that we've been doing developmental education out of context. It's decontextualized. We're doing skills. We're trying to get people to pass a math or an English gatekeeper course, when in reality, we need to be looking at why they're there in the first place. Why are they there? They're not there for developmental education. We need to look at where students are trying to go. And this is suggesting that we need to make some changes in the way that we've been dealing with developmental education. A research study called Get With the Program, Davis Jenkins at CCRC did this study. He found that outcomes were significantly higher for students who entered a program of study in the first year. The outcomes are so compelling that we need to be thinking about developmental education more broadly. Can we align developmental education to where students are trying to go in programs of study? We're at a point in the national conversation where we have to make a pivot. The conversation cannot be about addressing student academic deficiencies such that they can complete a math or English gatekeeper course. Given the information that we started with, the importance of the post-secondary credential, we really need to be thinking through, why are the students here? What are the most appropriate pathways, programs of study that can get these students into jobs that pay family-sustaining wages? That's the future of the work, and it is the future of the new initiative that North Carolina will be participating in, is participating in, and it really looks at the entire completion pathway. So the pivot is not just developmental education, but how do we look at the entire pathway? Developmental education doesn't happen in a vacuum. What are the antecedents? What happened before? What are the connections to college? Are there things that we can do to reduce the need for developmental education? In some cases, can we eliminate it through bridge programming, through dual enrollment? What can we do when students come into college? Right now, we don't have strong systems to connect students to programs of study. We don't have strong systems to connect them, to help them see, transparent pathways to where they might go. We can do that if we rethink our intake and college entry. And then what are we doing to make sure that students are progressing You know, again, remember in the HED data set, pulling the cover off of that progression through. What can we learn if we begin to monitor student progression? And how much better could we evaluate and get students into the right pathways if we track what's happening? What happens to students when they earn credentials and degrees? Are they able to go out and get a premium in wages? And if they are, what types of programs of study, what types of credentials can we take that to advise on the front end? You know, helping students understand, hey, if this is your interest, here are some wage outcomes, and here is a transparent path that you can go on. Oh, you're not academically prepared? Well, guess what? We are going to align your developmental education requirements with your program of study so that you are addressing whatever deficiencies you have in context. That's the future of the work. North Carolina has been such a willing and able partner. I think that you know, they just set a great example to some of the other states. I can say unequivocally that the system office here that is supporting your efforts, they are absolutely top-notch. I think that the other states that they work with would agree. I think that you can be confident that you are well represented. Your work is well represented in the national conversations. Other people are talking about what you do because the system office is collaborating across states. I think that there's no more important work than the work that you're doing, you know, to develop human capital, to develop pathways and strategies that help students earn credentials that have labor market value, as Mark said yesterday, that can help them break the intergenerational cycle of poverty. But for me, I think the key point is that your work can help them live self-directed lives, and I don't think that there's anything that's more important than that, and I commend you on your work. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Good morning. I would like to echo Michael's comments. This work that I'm about to talk about comes from conversations with President Rawls and Sharon Morrissey, Cynthia Liston, and Brad Bastian, where they asked us a set of questions which we didn't know the answers to, and then we slowly decided to figure out ways to answer these questions, and we came up with the research which I'm about to present to you today. I should emphasize that they have supported this research, but they are not responsible for any of the conclusions or findings or errors. So, as Cynthia mentioned, that access is a broad concept, but we're, in our research that we've been doing for the last 18 months now, we're drilling down to access to college-level classes. So this brings us to the entry point that Michael referred to, developmental education through to college. And the simple story that can be summarized in 3 words, really: high school GPA. That's actually 5 words, so it's really 3 words plus or minus 2. But high school GPA is kind of the headline of the story here. So enhancing access to college-level classes. And as Michael mentioned, most of the students are not entering college-level classes when they get to college. They're entering developmental education, and this is a big part of college provision, and it's an influential part of college provision, and it really affects the ultimate outcomes for students. So only about 1/3 of students ever complete the developmental education sequence they're put into. 1 in 7 will eventually pass college math, and they're about 1/4 to 40% less likely to graduate if they're assigned to developmental education. So it's big, it's influential, and it really is an initial important barrier to getting access to college courses. And assignment is mostly performed using the big 2, AccuPlacer and Compass, and also asset tests in math and reading. There are waivers, but we're really interested in the bulk of students who have to take an AccuPlacer or Compass, or in some cases an asset test, in order to determine their placement in college level or developmental education courses. The results I'm about to present are North Carolina results, but we have done this exact same analysis in another system and found the same results. And so we are pretty confident that this is a national story, or it's certainly not just a North Carolina story. It's a broader story for developmental education. And again, to emphasize Michael, it's really an advantage to be in the vanguard of this, to be getting the analysis and the results and the studies done ahead of everybody else, because we do suspect that this is a broader issue. So we're using North Carolina data to look at these placement tests. And once we start thinking about access to college-level courses, we have to think of a rule for how to place students. And we break it down very simply. We say, well, some students should be in developmental education, but we don't want to put students in developmental education who shouldn't be there. We don't want to underplace students. We don't want to set them back a semester or cause them to take courses they don't want to take. So we don't want to underplace students. But then again, we do want to put students in developmental education courses who do need to be there. We don't want to put them straight into college-level math, see them fail college-level math, and then they drop out. So we don't want to underplace and we don't want to overplace students. And of course, this creates for decisions, for statisticians, it creates this trade-off, a balancing act. If your test is very tough, you're going to put a lot of students into developmental education who shouldn't be there. And if your test is very easy, everybody's going to be promoted to college-level courses, and there are many more of them are going to fail. So it's a balancing act. It's almost like type 1, type 2 errors for the statisticians. You miss on the one side and you miss on the other side, and the test is calibrated so that you're going to have both types of misses, but you want to try to minimize the misses on either side. So in our study, we calculate something called an error rate. We actually call it a severe error rate, but here I'll just call it an error rate. And it's simply the sum of people who we think are underplaced and overplaced. Now, overplaced is relatively easy to understand. Overplaced just means we put you in the college level class, but you failed that class pretty badly, and so you really mustn't have been prepared for that class. That's pretty straightforward. The harder thing to think about is we put you in developmental education, but really you could have got a pretty good grade in the college level class. And we define pretty good grade as a B or above. So in other words, you were assigned to developmental education, and we predict, based on a model that we use the data for, we predict you would have probably gotten a B in the college level course. So this is a severe error because it's a severe underplace. We're really holding these students back who really would have done okay if they had been put straight into college level classes. And we use detailed transcript data to predict who is likely to be overplaced and underplaced, and then we add those two numbers up to get an error rate. Now, there are details of the model on the website, but I'll just summarize the results here. These are the error rates for the placement tests. So you can see there's a college English test, a college math test, and in North Carolina we split the college there's a college English course, entry course, and then there is, in our way of thinking, there were two college math entry courses. So this is like English 110 and Math 140, Math 160, something like that. And these are the error rates for the compass test and the AccuPlacer test. So you can see that overplacement and underplacement for college English is about a quarter of the students. So on this model, about a quarter of the students are, at least on compass, a quarter of the students in English are probably in the wrong place. College math, it's a little higher for one college math. For the other college math, it's a little lower. It's the same level of error for the AccuPlacer test. So it's not a test-driven error. It's not really a subject-driven error, although math tests tend to be a little more accurate than English tests. It's a general error of just placing students into developmental education versus college level classes. Now, everybody makes errors all the time. Economists are pretty good at making errors. We make at least 7 errors for every 5 projections that we make, so we're in pretty good shape making errors too. And these are errors. This is a balancing act, and you have to draw the line somewhere, and you're going to make errors. You're going to hold students back, and you're going to promote students inaccurately. So the question is not so much how errorful is this system, but is there a system that is less errorful relative to the placement test? And this brings me to my alternative. And the alternative is to look at a student's high school GPA. So what we do is we get high school GPA data, and we merge it in with the North Carolina transcript data, and we look at how high school GPA influences your progression all the way through the North Carolina community college system. And the bottom line is that high school GPA is a really strong predictor of how well a student is going to do. It's much better than the placement test. It's much better than the ACT. Not a lot of students take the ACT, but the students who do, that test has very low power compared to the high school GPA. And it's better than the SAT as well in predicting how a student will perform. And this is true of how well the student will perform in the developmental education courses. It's true of how well they will perform in the Gatekeeper college level courses, Gatekeeper Math, Gatekeeper English. And it's true of college GPA. So a student's college GPA is very strongly predicted by their high school GPA. And it's also true of college credits earned. The higher the student's high school GPA, the much higher their college credits are. A very large number, something like 10 extra credits within 3 to 5 semesters. If your high school GPA goes from a C to a B, within 3 to 5 semesters you've earned about 10 credits more, which is a lot of college level credits. Now, high school GPA, you might think, is a very artificial number. It turns out it's not as artificial as you might think. We look at this and we can see that high school GPA is distributed quite nicely. It's not that there's a block of people who got 4.0s who would have gotten 5 if GPA ever went to 5. No, the distribution is quite normal, around about a 3, maybe just a little bit lower than a 3. And it's not a lot of students getting 0s who would have probably got -4s if high school GPA went to -4. No, it tails off nicely. So it's a nicely distributed variable. It's not very compressed. It doesn't have a lot of high peak, and it's not sort of all over the map. It's pretty normally distributed. It's pretty reasonable in that respect. High school GPA is also it's also not a school effect either. We looked at this in separate analyses, which I don't have time to talk about, but it's on the CCRC website. We look at how the schools differ, and we see, are there some schools that really give easy high school GPAs, and then some schools which give really low high school GPAs, and we're thinking, well, that's not really fair. It's not the fault of the student to go to a good school where GPAs are always lower. Turns out that's not really the case at all. There are hard grading schools and there are easy grading schools, but very few of those schools. And most of the schools, the high school GPA has pretty much the same association with college performance. So the idea that a student will come in and say, oh, well, I went to a really tough high school, that doesn't have a lot of credibility in the data. It's also, we looked at the districts. It's not true that districts are really driving this result either. Some districts are really tough graders in high school and some are not. That doesn't seem to be the case either. Excuse me. So we think high school GPA is a pretty good variable for predicting college outcomes. So the obvious question is, can we do a better job of placing students in developmental education if we use high school GPA? So what we do is we say, let's keep the rate of developmental education constant. We're not changing the numbers of students who go into developmental education. We'll just put them in there based on their high school GPAs. and then we'll predict who's likely to be underplaced and overplaced, and calculate the same sort of error rate that we predicted for the placement tests. So it's sort of like a simulation just using high school GPA instead of a placement test. And when we do that, we get results that look like this. These are the error rates for high school GPA. So these are much lower rates, and certainly in the case of Compass, they're much more consistent across subjects. So you can see the error rate is about 12% for college English, goes down to just over 10% for college math for Compass, and then for AccuPlacer, the error rate is about 16%, so that's 1 in 7 students. And then for college math, it's 8%, so that's 1 in 12 students is probably in the wrong level of class. And it's possibly easiest to see them together. So these are the two rates, error rates in comparison. The blue ones are the placement test error rates, and the red ones are the high school GPA error rates. So the story seems pretty clear from this analysis, which is that the error rate is much lower if we use high school GPA as an access rule for college courses. Now, this is a model. It's got a lot of assumptions in it. It's a predictive model. It's not the real world that you face, where a student comes to you and says, I want to be in college-level classes, and you somehow have to negotiate a placement rule for the student. But it does give us a lot of grounds for thinking that using high school information is going to be very valuable in making the access decisions. And this result is, as I mentioned, there is another system we do this in that the results are the same in terms of the difference between the red and blue bars there for error. Now, how would this work in practice? Well, in practice, you would have to assign students to developmental education using a high school GPA cutoff, essentially. And if we do that in our model, if we assume that the college uses a high school GPA cutoff to assign students to developmental education, what would happen? Well, the developmental education rate, depending on the cutoff of high school GPA, the developmental education rate would probably go down a little bit. Obviously, it depends what the cutoff is, but it wouldn't eliminate developmental education in any sense. It would just shave a few points off developmental education. But at the same time, it would move some students who were overplaced, it would move them back into developmental education, but it would move more students who were underplaced out of developmental education straight into college-level courses. So there would be more students in college-level courses. The error rate would be lower, as we've seen the difference between the blue and the red bars, mainly because the failure rate in developmental education would go down. There would be a slight increase in the college-level pass rate. The college-level failure rate would also go down a little bit. But mainly it's about getting the students who were underplaced, getting them into college-level courses. That's the main effect of using high school GPA. In other words, when we thought about this, we thought, well, you worry about promoting students beyond their level. But in the model we have, it seems like that worry is too big a worry. And that worry looms too large so that there are too many students who are underplaced, too many students in developmental education who could have gotten into college, could have passed a college-level course. So in that sense, we think that high school GPA would improve access to college, at least as we've defined it, as access to college-level classes, if we use the high school GPA rule. And for those of you who teach classes, there would probably be some within class or within level convergence in aptitude. That is to say, the students who were in developmental education would be a more homogeneous group because you wouldn't have as many students who really found developmental education too easy because they'd be moved into the college level classes. So those are the consequences of the high school GPA rule as applied. It depends on the cutoff, which we didn't we obviously don't set the cutoffs. Now, one problem that we thought of is that this is a great idea in theory, but how is it going to work in practice? And one of the problems that immediately comes up is that high school GPA is a single number. It's not a math number or an English number, it's a single number. And so the worry is that you're placing a student, you're essentially using one less piece of information than the placement tests where you have two tests. Now, as it turns out, we thought the bigger worry would be the math faculty would be saying high school GPA does not explain math skills. As it turns out, when we look at correlations, we see that high school GPA predicts just as well in math as it does in English. I put up those 6 bars there to show that the correlation is the same between high school GPA and your grades in any of your developmental education courses. It doesn't matter whether this is a math course or an English course, the correlation between your high school GPA and your grade in the developmental education course is about 35%. So a very high number, but also a constant number. It's not a number that varies. It's not as if math is really badly predicted by high school GPA and English is very well predicted. They're both predicted well to the same level. So that was somewhat surprising to us, a little bit more comforting, but somewhat surprising. Also, the high school GPA predicts well in college level math just as well as it does in college level English. And just to throw it in, high school GPA also predicts your income at age 40 with pretty good accuracy too, certainly much better than college credits and other sort of test score measures. So I gulped a little bit about that. I wish I'd done better in high school when I realized this was hurting me right now, but anyway, it's a little too late. So high school GPA appears to have a lot of information in it, and we were very surprised by that result. We thought it would be a good predictor, but we didn't expect it to be that good a predictor, and so we tried to build a model of what is this thing, high school GPA, what does it really embody, and it's certainly more than a test. It's a measure of it's a measure of effort and diligence, and sort of it's not just one test, it's more like 100 different tests and assignments and things all over the years. So it's not just a test, it's got some effort component in it too. But that's some of what we're not really able to explain very well what it is about high school GPA, what the underlying traits are in high school GPA that make it such a useful predictor of college performance, even developmental education performance, and even gatekeeper performance, where high school GPA has already been mediated by the placement test. So that suggests to us a relatively simple rule based on high school GPA, but of course high school GPA is really a cognitive measure. It's not a non-cognitive measure. It's not really a good measure of effort and diligence and conscientiousness and showing up necessarily. So we thought, well, 2 things. First, if this is a predictive model, it's always better to use more information than less information. So if we're going to try to predict who's going to do well in developmental education, who's going to do well in college, we want to use more information. More information is always better. Statistically, more information is always better. So this is the idea of multiple measures. And more information is always better if you can get more information. So more information is better in theory, but practically it's very hard to get more information that isn't just the same information you already had called something else. So in our case, we looked at the placement tests, and we looked at high school, and we said, well, why don't we stick the 2 together? Why don't we take their high school GPA and their placement tests, stick it together? It turns out the high school GPA is so strong, it doesn't need the placement test to help it along in terms of prediction. The same is true for the high school transcript. We looked at the high school transcript, number of F courses, number of math courses, number of English courses, went all the way through the high school transcript as if we had time to sit there with the student and say, oh, this F looks bad, this math looks good, CTE courses, go through all the way through the transcript and try to predict using that. It turns out that even though that takes an awful lot of time, it doesn't gain you anything in predictive power. It doesn't help you. So you're faced with a long transcript, you might as well just look at high school GPA, and then the student will say, well, what about that A I got in astrophysics? No, I'm just looking at that 3.6. That's all I'm looking at. I'm not interested in the A in astrophysics, the B in economics, whatever. It's too confusing because there are so many bits to the high school transcript, and those bits tend to give not conflicting, but offsetting information to you. So you're reading a high school transcript, and I'm thinking, I do this myself with students. I'm reading a transcript. I'm trying to get an idea of what the students like. And in the statistical model, it turns out that that reading is really just me trying to be Mr. Finesse. I should just look at the GPA. That's going to give me as much information as I get from my artistic reading of the transcript. So the high school transcripts turn out to be too confusing. And also for many of you, it's very hard to bargain with the student. The students sort of come to me and they say, well, I want to be in college courses, and this is my bargaining offer to be in college level courses. Well, bargaining takes a lot of time, and in some cases it needs to be a simple rule that everybody can agree on that's pre-announced. So we ruled out high school transcripts as a supplement or an alternative to high school GPA. We looked at non-cognitive tests, but there are an awful lot of these non-cognitive tests. Many of them are not applied to large samples of students, only subgroups of students. And these non-cognitive tests a lot of them are behavioral. How do you feel about, are you ready? Do you feel ready for college? As opposed to knowledge-based. And these would need to explain a lot of different information from high school GPA in order for them to be useful, to be added on. So we didn't get very far with thinking about those as effective alternatives to using high school GPA for access to college level courses. Now, not everybody has a high school GPA, and some students' high school GPA may not be valid, it may be missing, it may be hard to interpret, so you would still have to use placement tests for some students or some alternative metric. So this is not a suggestion to completely replace all assignment with high school GPA. It's more of a high school GPA is a much more powerful assignment tool than we had anticipated and would hopefully reduce the error rate for placement into college level classes. So, in conclusion, by access, we really mean access to college level classes, and we know that that is not even remotely a norm or typical for most entering students. But we want access to college classes for students who have a reasonable chance of passing those college level classes. And that means that we have to weigh the likelihood that they will fail with the cost of putting them in developmental education. And based on our analysis, we think that high school GPA would do a better job of that for a wider range of a range of students, not all students, but a range of students. It would do a better job of that to improve access to college courses. It would change the composition of the classes a little bit because you would be moving students around from underplacement and overplacement. But those error rate differences are so large that it gives us a lot of pause about using placement tests for a large proportion of students. High school GPA can't assign all the students, so you still need other measures to try to predict college level performance. And ideally, you would like multiple measures because more information is always better. But more information comes at a cost. It undermines the rules. It generates a whole set of bargaining and legitimacy issues. It creates a time issue. an interpretation issue, a changing of the rules issue. So multiple measures would have to be capturing other dimensions of student aptitude that are thought to be very important to success in college-level math and college-level English. And certainly would be very helpful if those were available to us. And then finally, we have to recognize that this is an access rule that balances these two errors. That we have overplacement and underplacement, and any assignment rule is going to make errors on both sides. And if we had to say that the errors were weighted too much, we think right now, sorry, the screen seems to... We think right now, thank you, we think right now that the error is on the, there are too many students who were put in developmental education who could have made it through the college level class. So that balancing act right now seems to be a little tipped into, let's put students in developmental education as a, not quite as a default, but more as a presumption than the other way around. But it also suggests that if you're always going to have errors, then a broader solution is to try to minimize the cost of any error. So let's not make these errors too costly. There are always going to be errors, but a broader goal, which we don't talk about here, which I know you are very engaged in and many other states are engaged in, is to try to reduce the cost of making an error, recognizing that you're going to make some of these errors, but try to reduce the cost of them. So by changing essentially this, by accelerating students through developmental education or supporting them to get through it or assigning them to different sequences, that whole suite of reforms that are ongoing that appear to have very strong motivation in the results in our study. So I had to go through that very quickly, especially for a Monday morning at 9 o'clock. There's a lot more information on all of these issues on the CCRC website, and certainly there are the papers with the information in, and other studies that Michael referred to by colleagues at CCRC on developmental education. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Clive. I know that was an incredibly rich and thought-provoking set of presentations, and we really appreciate you being here. Also, there's an expanded version of the presentation that Clive just gave on the SuccessNC website. So go to successnc.org and look at the webinars, and it's the multiple measures one that he participated in a couple of weeks ago. So again, thank you, and for this great start to the morning. Thank you.